I learned the hard way that exhaustion can look exactly like failure if the wrong person walks into the room at the wrong moment. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the blinking cursor on my third monitor, and a taste of cold coffee that had been sitting beside my keyboard for nearly 12 hours. My name is Emily Carter, and at exactly 8:17 on a gray Monday morning, Damian Blackwood looked at me asleep at my desk for less than 5 seconds before deciding I no longer deserved a place inside his company. He never asked why my security dashboard was still running. He never noticed the hundreds of warning windows quietly disappearing one after another. He never saw the digital battlefield I had been fighting alone for the previous 48 hours. All he saw was another employee sleeping on company time. The executive floor of Blackwood Technologies was always silent before 9. Thick glass walls reflected the pale Manhattan sunrise while the city slowly woke beneath us. Outside, yellow taxis crawled through traffic like tiny toys. Inside, the only sounds came from cooling servers, humming ventilation systems, and the soft tapping of keyboards from the few engineers who had survived another all-night deployment. My shoulders burned every time I moved. My eyes felt packed with sand. I had forgotten what real sleep even felt like. 2 energy drink cans sat beside my monitor along with 3 untouched protein bars that I kept promising myself I would eat after fixing just one more vulnerability. Every time I solved one problem, another appeared. Someone out there refused to stop knocking on our digital front door. They weren't teenagers looking for attention. They weren't random criminals hoping to steal passwords. Whoever they were, they understood our infrastructure almost as well as we did. They knew where to probe, where to wait, and where to hide. For 2 straight days I had chased invisible footprints through millions of lines of encrypted traffic while the rest of the company believed everything was operating normally. That was the point. If I did my job perfectly, no one would ever know there had been a crisis at all. My smartwatch buzzed again, reminding me that my heart rate had stayed above 100 for almost 7 hours. I dismissed the notification without looking. Somewhere behind me, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Expensive leather shoes crossed the marble floor at an unhurried pace. Even before I saw him, everyone else straightened in their chairs. Damian Blackwood never announced his arrival. He didn't have to. At 34, he carried authority the way storms carried thunder. His tailored charcoal suit looked untouched by the rain outside, and every decision he made seemed carved from stone long before anyone heard it spoken. People said he could read weakness faster than financial reports. They admired that about him. They feared it even more. My eyelids grew heavier for one impossible second. I told myself I would close my eyes only until the next security scan finished. Just 1 second. Just one breath. Just enough to stop the room from spinning. When I finally opened them again, Damian Blackwood was standing directly across my desk, and the first words he ever spoke to me were calm, cold, and sharp enough to change both of our lives forever. "You're fired." I did not argue. I did not beg. I simply looked at him, while my exhausted brain struggled to understand the words I had just heard. Around us, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire cybersecurity operations center felt frozen beneath the white lights hanging from the ceiling. Damian Blackwood waited exactly 3 seconds before speaking again. "Human resources will process your termination before noon." His voice was steady, controlled, almost emotionless. The kind of voice that never expected resistance because it had never needed to. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood on legs that barely remembered how to hold me upright. My muscles protested every movement. My vision blurred for a moment before the room settled into focus again. "Understood," I answered quietly. That single word surprised even me. Part of me wanted to explain everything. I wanted to tell him about the unauthorized login attempts that had started just after sunrise 2 days earlier. I wanted to show him the attack map still glowing across my center monitor. I wanted him to understand that every alert disappearing from the screen represented another disaster quietly avoided. Instead, I closed my laptop. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard for only a heartbeat before I removed my security badge and placed it carefully beside the mouse. If he had already decided who I was, no explanation would change his mind. Damien watched without another word. His expression never changed. To him, I was simply another employee who had failed to meet the standard. As I walked toward the elevator, dozens of coworkers avoided eye contact. A few looked sympathetic. Others looked relieved that it had not been them. Corporate buildings have a strange way of teaching people to protect themselves first. Nobody asked why I had looked like I had not slept in days. Nobody wondered why my workstation displayed hundreds of open security windows instead of spreadsheets or presentations. They only saw someone leaving with a cardboard box and assumed the story had already been written. The elevator doors closed softly, shutting out the executive floor behind me. For the first time in 48 hours, the constant hum of server fans disappeared. The silence almost hurt. I leaned against the polished metal wall and closed my eyes, but instead of relief, my thoughts returned to the alerts I had left behind. The attack had slowed overnight, but it had never truly stopped. Whoever was behind it had been testing our defenses, collecting information, waiting for the right moment. I had blocked thousands of suspicious connections, isolated compromised endpoints, rebuilt firewall rules, rotated privileged credentials, and written emergency detection scripts faster than I thought possible. I had even canceled dinner with my younger sister 2 nights in a row because I believed keeping the company safe mattered more than keeping a promise. My phone buzzed in my pocket just as the elevator reached the lobby. It was another automated security notification from a monitoring system that almost nobody else knew existed. I glanced at the message for less than a second. 3 unfamiliar network segments had suddenly become active. The same digital fingerprints I had been tracking all weekend were moving again. I looked back toward the executive elevators, wondering if I should turn around, but then I remembered the security badge sitting on my desk upstairs. I was no longer an employee. I was no longer authorized to protect the company that had just shown me the door. I slipped my phone back into my coat, stepped outside into the cold Manhattan morning, and walked away while somewhere above me, invisible lines of malicious code quietly searched for the one person who was no longer there to stop them. I had barely reached the subway entrance when my phone vibrated again. Then again. Then 3 more times in less than 20 seconds. Every instinct I had developed over years in cybersecurity told me the pattern was wrong. Automated alerts never arrived like that unless multiple systems started failing together. I stopped beneath the steel awning outside the station, while cold rain tapped softly against the sidewalk. My fingers unlocked the screen almost automatically. The emergency monitoring application was still connected because it lived on my personal device, separate from company hardware. Bright red notifications filled the display faster than I could read them. External authentication requests had doubled. 2 backup gateways were reporting unusual traffic. Someone had begun probing the cloud environment from entirely new locations. They had changed tactics. They had been waiting for exactly this moment. I stared at the screen, feeling my stomach tighten. 48 hours of defending the network had taught me one thing above everything else. The first wave had never been the real attack. It had been a distraction designed to exhaust whoever stood between them and the company. They had succeeded. I was exhausted. More importantly, I was gone. I looked back toward the glass tower rising above the Manhattan streets. Blackwood Technologies reflected the gray morning sky as though nothing had changed inside. Employees continued entering through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups and laptop bags. Delivery trucks unloaded supplies along the curb. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. That was the cruel thing about cyber attacks. Buildings did not shake. Lights did not flicker. People smiled, laughed, and attended meetings while invisible battles unfolded behind every screen. I opened my email one last time. My company account had already been disabled. Every folder disappeared before my eyes. Years of reports, scripts, documentation, and security notes vanished behind an access denied message. It felt strangely personal, as though someone had quietly erased proof that I had ever belonged there. I could have walked away. Legally, professionally, emotionally, I probably should have. Instead, I sat on a damp bench across the street and watched the security alerts continue climbing. My thumb hovered over Damian Blackwood's executive contact information. I had received it months earlier during an emergency infrastructure meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes. He had told every department head to contact him immediately if the company ever faced an existential threat. This qualified. I almost called. Almost. Then I remembered the look in his eyes as he watched me remove my badge. Calm certainty. Absolute judgment. He had not asked a single question because he believed he already had every answer. If I called now, would he even listen? Or would he assume I was simply refusing to accept being fired? I slowly lowered the phone. Pride had nothing to do with it. Trust did. Once someone decided you were irresponsible, every warning you gave sounded like an excuse. I slipped the phone into my coat and forced myself to stand. The rain had grown heavier, washing across the sidewalks in thin silver streams. Halfway down the block, another vibration stopped me. This notification came from a private script I had secretly written months earlier to monitor unusual encryption activity across public networks. One line flashed across the screen in bold letters. Critical anomaly detected. Estimated attack escalation in less than 60 minutes. I closed my eyes for one long breath, realizing the countdown had already begun, and the only people who knew it were the attackers, and me. I wish I could tell you that someone inside the building noticed the warning signs the moment I walked away. They did not. Success is a strange thing in cybersecurity. When everything works, people assume nothing important happened. Upstairs, meetings began exactly on schedule. Fresh coffee filled the executive conference room while department heads discussed quarterly growth, new acquisitions, and expansion into international markets. Damian Blackwood listened with his usual calm expression, occasionally asking precise questions that forced everyone else to think faster. Numbers mattered to him. Efficiency mattered. Discipline mattered. Hidden victories that never appeared on financial reports rarely entered the conversation. 3 floors below, the cybersecurity operations center looked very different. Empty coffee cups surrounded my abandoned workstation. My monitors had locked automatically after my account was disabled, leaving behind dark screens that reflected the worried faces of my teammates. Ryan, the senior network analyst, frowned as he studied the live traffic dashboard. "That cannot be right," he whispered under his breath. One of the graphs had begun climbing almost vertically. Another analyst refreshed the display twice before looking over his shoulder. "Is the monitoring system broken?" Nobody answered. More alerts appeared. Authentication failures increased by the second. Internal servers started rejecting perfectly normal requests while unfamiliar traffic quietly spread across multiple regions. It looked less like one attack and more like dozens happening simultaneously. Ryan reached for the emergency documentation binder before stopping halfway through the motion. Every page describing the custom detection scripts pointed to one person. Emily Carter. He opened my project folder instead. Empty. My company account had already been deactivated, automatically locking every internal note I had written during the previous 2 years. "Can somebody restore her access?" another engineer asked. "Human resources already processed the termination," someone replied quietly. The room fell silent. For the first time that morning, uncertainty replaced routine. Ryan opened the security logs manually, scrolling through thousands of entries until something caught his attention. Hidden beneath ordinary network activity was a pattern almost too organized to notice. Every suspicious connection had been blocked seconds before reaching critical systems. Every firewall adjustment had occurred while most employees were asleep. Every emergency patch had been deployed under my administrator credentials. He checked the timestamps again. Saturday evening. Sunday morning. Sunday night. Monday before dawn. 48 straight hours. His expression changed completely. Upstairs, Damian's phone vibrated once against the polished conference table. He ignored it. 5 minutes later it vibrated again. Then 3 more times in rapid succession. Finally, His chief technology officer glanced down at his own screen and slowly lost all color in his face. "Sir," he said carefully, interrupting the meeting for the first time anyone could remember. "I think you need to see this." Damien accepted the tablet without visible emotion. A live network map filled the display. Small red indicators were appearing across the company's digital infrastructure one after another like raindrops spreading across glass. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself became the answer. Downstairs, Ryan finally located the archived system logs stored outside employee accounts. He opened the first file. Then the second. Then another. Every page revealed the same name beside thousands of successful defensive actions. Emily Carter. Working through Saturday night. Emily Carter. Sunday afternoon. Emily Carter. 3 o'clock Monday morning. His breathing slowed as the full timeline came into focus. The woman everyone believed had fallen asleep on the job had actually spent 2 days preventing a disaster that almost nobody even knew existed. And now the only person who truly understood the attack was walking farther away from the building with every passing minute. Damien did not speak for nearly a full minute. The conference room remained completely still except for the faint sound of rain tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Everyone watched him study the timeline scrolling across the tablet in his hands. Every entry carried the same digital signature. Every emergency response pointed to one engineer. Every crisis had been resolved before anyone else even knew it existed. His eyes moved slowly from one timestamp to the next. Saturday, 6:14 in the evening. Unauthorized credential harvesting blocked. Saturday, 11:52 at night. Emergency firewall policies rewritten. Sunday, 4:08 in the morning. Malicious persistence removed from cloud infrastructure. Sunday afternoon. Encryption keys rotated. Monday before sunrise. Critical authentication gateway stabilized. Hundreds of successful defensive actions stretched across nearly 48 consecutive hours. Damien finally looked up. "Who approved this schedule?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered. The chief technology officer cleared his throat. "Nobody did. She volunteered after discovering unusual network behavior on Saturday evening." Damien's expression remained unreadable, but his next question came much faster. "Why was she working alone?" Another uncomfortable silence settled over the room. "She requested additional staff twice," the technology officer admitted. "Most of the department believed the threat level was exaggerated because customer systems were still operating normally." Damien lowered his eyes back to the screen. They were operating normally because Emily had never allowed them to fail. Ryan entered the conference room carrying another tablet. "Sir, there's something else you should see." He connected it to the large display on the wall. Security camera footage appeared without sound. The recording showed the cybersecurity operations center late Saturday night. Emily remained at her desk while the rest of the floor slowly emptied. Hours passed in accelerated playback. Cleaning crews arrived and left. Morning sunlight filled the windows. Employees returned carrying fresh coffee while she never once stood for more than a minute. The video continued into Sunday. She stretched her sore shoulders, splashed water across her face in the break room, and immediately returned to her monitors. Another night arrived. Another sunrise followed. Finally, Monday morning appeared. Emily leaned back for the first time in almost 2 days. Her eyes closed. Less than 3 minutes later, Damien entered the room. The footage froze exactly where he stopped beside her desk. Nobody spoke. Damien watched himself standing over an employee who had already given everything she had left to give. He remembered what he had seen that morning. A tired woman asleep during work hours. Now he saw something completely different. Someone who had protected his company until her body simply refused to keep going. "Rewind 30 seconds, he said. Ryan obeyed. Damien noticed details he had ignored before. The untouched food containers stacked beside her keyboard. The handwritten notes, covering half the desk. The empty coffee cups. The security dashboard still processing live threats across every monitor. None of it had registered because he had already reached his conclusion before looking closely. His phone suddenly rang. It was the director of infrastructure. Damien answered immediately. Report. The voice on the other end sounded unusually tense. We have confirmed coordinated intrusion attempts across multiple regions. Internal defenses are slowing the activity, but several custom protections have stopped updating since Emily's account was disabled. We cannot determine how she configured them because the documentation is incomplete. Damien closed his eyes for one brief moment. The mistake was no longer theoretical. It was already costing them time they could not afford. When he opened them again, his voice remained calm, but everyone in the room noticed something had changed. Find Emily Carter, he said. Right now. Before whoever she was fighting realizes she is no longer here. Finding me turned out to be much harder than anyone expected because I was not running away. I was simply doing what exhausted people do when they finally stop moving. I sat inside a quiet neighborhood coffee shop 6 blocks from the office with a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold again. My laptop remained closed on the table in front of me. For the first time in 2 days, I was trying to convince myself not to open it. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath a pale afternoon sun. Around me, people laughed over lunch meetings, college students studied for exams, and a young father helped his little daughter color on a paper placemat. The world continued as though nothing important had happened. My phone rested beside the coffee untouched. I knew the alerts were still arriving. I knew the monitoring scripts I had written would never stop unless I disabled them myself. But every vibration reminded me of something I was no longer allowed to protect. Across Manhattan, Blackwood Technologies had entered a different kind of silence. The emergency response team filled the operations center while giant screens displayed live network activity from around the world. Nobody panicked. They simply worked faster. Yet despite every effort, unfamiliar patterns continued spreading through the system. The attackers were adapting with unsettling precision. Every defensive rule Emily had manually adjusted over the weekend was being tested from a different angle. Automated protections responded exactly as designed, but without the person who understood why they existed, the team was always reacting one step behind. Ryan leaned closer to another analyst. Look at this. A cluster of suspicious connections disappeared before suddenly reappearing through an entirely different route. They already know how we blocked the first wave. The analyst frowned. It is like they expected us to copy her previous rules instead of thinking ahead. Ryan slowly nodded because that was exactly what they had done. Emily had never defended the same attack twice. She anticipated the next move before it happened. They were only repeating what she had already built. Damien stood quietly behind the team, watching every screen without interrupting anyone. Years of leading complex organizations had taught him that chaos often spoke louder than reports. He noticed engineers skipping lunch. He noticed empty energy drink cans appearing beside keyboards. Most importantly, he noticed something else. Every few minutes someone asked the same question. How did Emily solve this last time? Nobody knew the answer. She had never worked for recognition. She had worked for results. An assistant hurried into the room carrying a folder. Sir, Human Resources recovered her emergency contact information. Damien accepted the paper. One address. One phone number. No social media accounts connected to the company. No public interviews. No professional awards despite 2 years of exceptional performance reviews. She had left almost no trace beyond the work itself. His phone rang again before he could respond. This time it was the infrastructure director. We have another problem, the man said. Several financial transaction servers have entered protective lockdown. Customer information remains secure, but processing speeds have dropped significantly. If this continues through the afternoon, thousands of business clients will begin experiencing delays. Damien looked through the glass wall into the operations center where exhausted engineers struggled to keep pace with an invisible enemy. Then he looked back at the address in his hand. For the first time in years, solving the problem would not depend on authority, wealth, or influence. It depended on earning the trust of one woman he had dismissed without ever asking her a single question. I noticed him the second he stepped through the coffee shop door, even though he was wearing a dark overcoat instead of the tailored suit I had seen that morning. Some people carried authority so naturally that changing clothes could never hide it. Damian Blackwood paused near the entrance, scanning the room with quiet focus until his eyes met mine. He did not bring security. He did not bring assistance. He walked across the worn wooden floor alone, carrying nothing except the weight of a mistake he had finally begun to understand. I considered leaving before he reached my table, but I was simply too tired to run from another conversation. He stopped a respectful distance away. "May I sit down?" he asked. It was the first question he had ever asked me. I looked at the empty chair across from mine and gave a small nod. He sat carefully, studying the untouched coffee in front of me before speaking again. "I watched the security footage." His voice sounded different now. Still calm, but no longer certain. "I reviewed the system logs. I know what you did for the company." I wrapped both hands around the paper cup, welcoming the little warmth it still held. "Do you?" I asked quietly. He nodded once. "Not soon enough." Those 3 words lingered between us. They were honest, but honesty alone could not erase what had already happened. Outside, pedestrians hurried past the windows while traffic rolled steadily through the wet streets. Inside, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he leaned forward slightly. "Emily, I made a decision without understanding the situation. That was my mistake." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You did not make a mistake because I was asleep." His eyes remained fixed on mine. "You made a mistake because you never asked why." Something changed in his expression. Not defensiveness. Recognition. The kind that arrives when someone realizes the lesson extends far beyond a single moment. "You are right," he admitted. "I judged what I saw instead of investigating what I did not." My phone vibrated softly on the table. Neither of us looked away. Another security alert. Then another. Damien noticed the screen lighting up repeatedly. "They are still attacking, are they not?" he asked. I finally glanced down before locking the display again. "Yes." "Can my team stop them?" I took a slow breath before answering honestly. "Eventually, maybe. Before serious damage is done? I do not know." He sat back quietly. "Come back with me." I almost smiled, not because the request amused me, but because it arrived exactly the way I expected. Direct. Simple. As though returning were only a matter of walking through the same doors I had left a few hours earlier. I slowly shook my head. "I cannot." His brow tightened slightly. "Because I fired you?" "Because trust is part of security," I answered. "Every firewall, every encryption key, every emergency protocol depends on trust. This morning you showed me that 2 years of work could disappear in 5 seconds because of one assumption. I cannot pretend that never happened." Damien lowered his eyes to the table. For the first time since we met, silence belonged to him instead of me. Then my phone vibrated again, longer this time. The alert banner appeared across the screen before I could stop myself from reading it. Critical financial systems entering secondary failure threshold. Estimated widespread service disruption in 15 minutes. I closed my eyes, knowing exactly what that message meant, and when I opened them again I realized I was no longer deciding whether to forgive Damian Blackwood. I was deciding whether thousands of innocent employees and customers deserved to pay for a mistake that had never been theirs. I picked up my laptop before I picked up my coffee. That probably told Damien everything he needed to know. I was still hurt. I was still disappointed. But the people depending on those systems had never judged me. They had never dismissed me without asking a question. Somewhere inside Blackwood Technologies, thousands of employees were simply trying to do their jobs. Thousands of customers trusted the company with their businesses, their savings, and their futures. They deserved protection even if I no longer worked there. I slipped the laptop into my backpack and stood. Damien rose with me but kept a respectful distance. "Thank you," he said quietly. I looked at him and gently shook my head. "Do not thank me yet. I am not coming back for you." He accepted the answer without argument. "I understand." We left the coffee shop together and stepped into the cool afternoon air. Manhattan moved around us with its usual rhythm. Taxi horns echoed between tall buildings. Steam drifted from street vents. People hurried across crosswalks carrying umbrellas and grocery bags, completely unaware that an invisible battle was unfolding beneath the city through cables, servers, and data centers. Damien opened the passenger door of a black sedan, but I hesitated. "No driver," I said. "No security team. No unnecessary conversations. Every minute matters." Without saying a word, he walked around the vehicle and took the driver's seat himself. During the drive, neither of us spoke much. My laptop rested open across my knees while lines of live telemetry streamed across the screen. The attack had evolved again. They were no longer trying to force their way through the front door. They were patiently exploiting delayed responses between regional systems, creating tiny gaps that looked harmless by themselves but became dangerous together. Whoever planned this operation understood psychology as well as technology. They expected tired engineers to chase the loudest alarms while missing the quietest ones. "They want everyone looking in the wrong direction," I murmured. Damien glanced at me briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Can you still stop them?" I answered honestly. "Only if we are faster than they expect." We pulled into the underground parking garage less than 12 minutes later. The atmosphere inside the building had completely changed. Employees walked quickly through the hallways carrying laptops instead of coffee. Phones rang constantly. Large monitors displayed technical dashboards instead of corporate presentations. Nobody seemed interested in office politics anymore. They only cared whether the systems would survive the next hour. As the elevator doors opened onto the operations floor, every conversation stopped. Dozens of engineers looked toward me with expressions that mixed relief, embarrassment, and hope. Ryan stepped forward first. "Emily," he said softly. "I am sorry." I smiled faintly. "Apologize later. Show me the live network map." Within seconds, the largest display shifted to real-time telemetry. I studied the traffic patterns without speaking. Every colored line represented millions of legitimate customer requests mixed with carefully disguised malicious activity. The attackers had become bolder, but they had also become predictable. They believed removing me from the building had removed the strategy behind the defenses. They did not realize I had spent 48 hours learning how they thought. My fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as I opened one of the private monitoring scripts that still existed only on my personal laptop. Ryan leaned closer. "What are you looking for?" I did not answer immediately because the pattern had finally appeared. Hidden beneath thousands of ordinary transactions was one tiny sequence repeating every 90 seconds with almost perfect precision. I felt the exhaustion disappear beneath a sudden wave of clarity. I looked up at the giant screen, then at Damien standing silently behind the entire team, and said the words that changed the direction of everything. "They never wanted our data. They wanted us to believe they did. The real target has been hiding in plain sight the entire time." I enlarged the hidden traffic pattern until every engineer in the room could see it. At first it looked insignificant, just another stream of encrypted requests flowing through the network. Then I isolated its timing. Every 90 seconds the same sequence quietly redirected processing resources away from one specific authentication cluster before disappearing again. It was never trying to steal customer information. It was teaching our automated systems to distrust legitimate traffic while gradually exhausting the infrastructure from the inside. The attack depended on our own defenses, making the wrong decisions. "They built a trap for our artificial intelligence," I explained while opening another diagnostic window. "Every false signal makes the system a little more aggressive. Eventually it blocks the people it was designed to protect." Ryan stared at the screen before slowly nodding. "That is why nothing we changed stayed effective." "Exactly," I replied. We have been treating symptoms instead of removing the pattern that creates them. My fingers moved across the keyboard, rewriting several adaptive rules I had drafted during the previous weekend but never had the chance to deploy. Instead of reacting to each suspicious request individually, the new logic evaluated behavior over time, forcing every connection to prove consistency before receiving trust. The results appeared almost immediately. Red warning indicators stopped multiplying. Processing delays stabilized. The authentication clusters began recovering one after another. Around the operations center, shoulders relaxed for the first time all afternoon. Conversations returned. Phones stopped ringing quite so often. Nobody celebrated because experienced engineers knew stability had to last before it could be believed, but hope quietly returned to the room. 20 minutes later, the final monitoring report appeared across the main display. Unauthorized activity had dropped to background levels. Customer services continued operating normally. Financial systems resumed standard processing speeds. A wave of restrained applause spread through the room, not because someone had defeated an enemy, but because thousands of families and businesses would never know how close they had come to losing an ordinary day. I leaned back in my chair and finally allowed myself one long breath. My body immediately reminded me that 48 hours without real sleep still carried a price. Damien stepped forward only after everyone else had returned to work. Emily, he said, his voice carrying through the quiet operations center, I owe you something that should have happened before this morning. Every conversation stopped again. He faced not only me but the entire department. I judged one moment without understanding the story behind it. That decision was mine alone, and so is the responsibility for it. He placed my security badge gently on the desk beside my laptop. If you choose to return, your position is restored effective immediately. You will lead cybersecurity with full authority to build the team and resources you believe this company needs. If you decide not to return, that choice will be respected, and your contributions will remain part of this company's history. I looked at the badge for several seconds before picking it up. I will come back, I said quietly. Not because you asked me to. Not because of the title. Because the people in this building deserve leaders who learn from their mistakes as much as their successes. Damien gave a small nod, accepting the truth without trying to improve it. Months later, the strongest security system we ever built was not another firewall or another algorithm. It was a new rule that every executive, including Damien himself, agreed to follow. Before making a decision about a person, ask one more question than you think you need. Technology protects information. Trust protects people. I discovered that. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who quietly stays awake while everyone else sleeps, and sometimes the greatest act of leadership is having the courage to admit that you were wrong before it is too late.